Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. In this episode, we'll be talking about a topic that is important to both of us and has a big impact on a lot of hikers, our mental health.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about mental health issues. It's deep, it's important, and it's something that we both struggle with, as well as a lot of hikers that we've all talked to. I feel like we should warn listeners that we're going to be mentioning suicide just briefly in this podcast, so just be aware of that. But before we get into the heart of the show, let's spend a little time catching up and talk about our new favorite things. So, Ryan, what's new with you this year?
I have another batch of freeze-dried food going right now. We made a big batch of taco soup this weekend, and it is almost done in the freeze dryer and ready to package up into the Mylar bags.
Yeah, I saw your Instagram story on that. It looks delicious, and it looks like it'll go great with your guacamole.
It is one of my favorite meals. Stephanie's been making this for years now, and we've really got the recipe dialed in. And the only thing I changed was added a little more hot spice to it.
Oh yeah, you got to have that. You got to have that.
How about you?
Well, I just at some point last year, I decided that on my 36th birthday this year, I would try to run 36 miles. I decided this shortly after I completed my first marathon, and I did that over the last week.
That's fantastic. Congratulations.
Yeah, it really was terrible.
Yeah, tell me the experience. How did it evolve through the 36 miles?
So when I had been running to kind of get up to that level, I'd noticed that after about 20, 23, 24 miles or so, I'd kind of I called it the suck plateau. Like it just stopped getting worse and it just kind of just remained at a certain level of suck. So I kind of was expecting that to be the case all the way to 36 miles. And I got past 30, which was the furthest I'd ever run. And I went, oh, this is the furthest I've ever run. And then I immediately realized why that's the case, because I hit a wall really hard.
So what was the hardest miles you did? Was it early in the run or the very last ones?
It was definitely the very last ones, not the last couple of miles, because those are all downhill to my house, but yeah, 30 through 34 were really rough. Although my courses, I run out of my back door at my house, and my first mile is straight uphill. I think I gain like 1,000 feet in the first mile, so it always takes a mental effort to get that first mile done. So that's not fun either.
Well, congratulations. That's exciting.
Thank you. Well, let's move into talking about our new favorite things. I am testing a new shoe from Xero Shoes. Listeners of the podcast probably remember that I've tested a couple of their running shoes. This is a waterproof alpine boot designed for use in the snow. And by the time listeners hear this podcast, there will be a blog style review up on Backpacking Light. But I think these things are really great for keeping your feet warm and dry during snowshoeing. They're really comfortable. They've got a big wide toe box like Xero Shoes is kind of famous for. They're of course zero drop. They have very minimal midsole padding. The problem is that they have they've got very minimal external traction. Their lugs are very small, which again, if you're familiar with Xero Shoes, this is not going to be a surprise. But I was kind of thinking that when they launched a quote unquote winter boot, that they might put more aggressive lugs on it, and they just didn't. And so it's interesting. I was on a walk with my wife yesterday. She was wearing kind of classic Danner mid-height hikers, and she was just zooming up slick ice, and I was not doing that.
And neither of you guys were using traction devices?
No, but I will say that these shoes are great with traction devices. When I've worn them with either snowshoes or my external traction, they're awesome. And I gravitate towards this kind of thing in the winter because I just can't do the trail runner with waterproof sock thing. My feet just get too cold even if I'm
Mhm.
moving quickly. So that's why I was really excited about these, because I wanted something that felt like a trail runner but was waterproof and kept my feet warm. And these do 90% of what I need them to do, but the low traction is a problem.
That sounds intriguing. It's really hard to find a winter boot that is flexible to give you the minimalist feel.
Yeah, and these do that. The other footwear I'm trying out right now, I ran my ultra marathon in Innovate's Mudclaw G260 V2s. And basically, these are a shoe that Innovate designed for obstacle course racing. So they're pretty minimal. I think they've got a 6 millimeter drop, very unpadded midsole, but they're very tough and durable, and they have 8 millimeter lugs on them. And these things look wicked. And I got them because I wanted to run in the soft snow around my house without having to put traction devices on. And they work really well. They're not great on super slick ice, but nothing outside of metal spikes are. Um, but I think these are so cool that they make me really want to try the Terra Ultra G260s, which is Innovate's kind of like trail runner built along these same lines, but for hard pack trail, which is what I have in the summertime. So I think that's going to be my summer testing shoe, because I'm really looking for something that's durable. That's been my quest for years now, and I think these things have the chops to stay with me.
I'm really excited to see how durable those are. The uppers and the soles on those seem really intriguing and unique to me. And it would be so nice to have a trail running shoe that could last for more than a couple months.
Yeah, if I can get it past the 500-mile mark, I'm going to consider it a huge victory.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I'm also looking at winter footwear gear tweaks this year. I'm trying out the new Black Diamond Distance spikes. I've been using Catulas and Hill Sound traction devices for the last many years. And so the way I've been testing it is putting either the Catula or the Hill Sound on one foot and the Black Diamond Distance on the other.
Oh,
And
nice.
I have definitely now have enough experience, enough miles on them. We have about 50 to 60 miles on them now, where I can see some differences. And it's really interesting to me. It's been cold in Wyoming. We finally got snow. It's been 100% hiking in the snow now for the last several weeks. And so the Black Diamond Distance, its most unique feature is a soft shell toe cover. And I thought initially that, okay, this will help improve comfort because you're replacing this top elastic band that has the potential to dig into the instep of a
Hmm.
soft trail running shoe, and this might be more comfortable. And honestly, I don't notice too much of a difference between the two. But the real benefit of the soft shell toe cover is that it covers those lower shoelaces and prevents snow and ice from building up. And this is a huge thing over a long day, because when snow and ice builds up on the front of those laces, your toes actually start to get pretty cold. And I have noticed that there is a difference between how my toes feel at the end of a long hike wearing the Black Diamond Distance versus one of the other two crampons. And so that was kind of a pleasant surprise to discover.
Yeah, I love design things like that, where it's like, okay, how to improve something as basic as shoe traction, and
Yeah.
that's a really smart idea.
And the other thing I really like is that these have shorter spikes on them, which sounds counterintuitive for backpacking, but it allows for a more natural foot stride. And so especially the hill sounds, those spikes are pretty long on
No,
those,
yeah, they're
and
aggressive.
so you can swing your foot and catch it on the ground. And I've found myself tripping, especially at the end of a long day where I'm tired. And I don't have this at all. And it's a very subtle difference. It's just a couple millimeters, but it's enough to dramatically change your gait, especially if you're going fast or trail running. And so between the soft shell toe cover and the short spikes, I'm really liking the Black Diamond Distance.
Yeah, with the spikes, it just has to be the minimal amount of spike necessary to keep you traction, right?
That's
So
right.
there's yeah. Do you have any data on how much they weigh as compared to like the Hillsong
So my Hill Sound.
sound? Sorry, Hillsong's the Australian praise and worship band.
That's right. the um the Hill Sounds are They're about 12 ounces for the models that I have. And then my Catulas are about 10.5 ounces. The Black Diamond Distance are about 8 ounces. And all those weights are for the pair. So they are lighter. And again, you put one on one foot, one on the other, you're not going to dramatically notice the difference between 2 ounces. But, if you have to carry these things in your pack, every ounce counts. And I'll take the 8 ounces.
Yeah, 2 ounces on your feet will build up over the course of a day too. Big time.
There is another model that they sent me, but I haven't had the chance to use them yet. And I don't recall the exact name of them, but they are just a front spike model. So they don't have the soft shell toe cover. They have 6 spikes that go under the forefoot, and that's it. And so these are the ones that I think would be ideal for summertime use when you have to carry some insurance in your backpack and you just want to strap something on to climb a snowy pass or something.
Cool. Well, looking forward to that. Well, I want to get into our primary conversation here. And as a springing off point, I want to start with 2 articles that BPL published in 2012. And these actually just came to my attention because they've been getting a little bit of forum traffic lately. The first article was written by Cameron McNeish, and it was titled "Depression and Wilderness: The Benefit of Wilderness as Therapy." Can you tell us a little bit about that article?
Cameron is an outdoor writer from the United Kingdom, and he has been a thought leader in the outdoor space for decades, and he's always been someone I've looked up to, and being in the publishing industry has been a mentor of mine. And I've always thoughtfully considered everything he's always written, and this is one of the best things I think he's ever written. And really, it's the goal is try to connect people to a wilderness experience as a means of just kind of becoming resensitized to stimuli that are more natural rather than what we have in the world today. And science has gravitated towards the idea that stimuli, unnatural stimuli, especially in the information age, is a huge contributor to depression and anxiety. And so, Cameron's thesis is, hey, exit that and go into nature and let yourself heal a little bit.
And then a week later, BPL published something that you wrote, and you called it "Depression and Wilderness Part 2. Wilderness Might Not Be Enough." Can you tell us a little bit about that article?
Yeah, you bet. It was a response. It was a commentary in response to people who challenged Cameron's thesis because of systemic physiological depression. And I understand that. And I just wanted to clarify that no, we're not proposing wilderness as the cure all. It's not, especially for those who have, legit physiological issues with depression and anxiety. And so my goal was just to expand on what Cameron was saying and say, hey, there are other issues related to lifestyle, your brain's function and your physiology that can contribute to this. And I want to acknowledge that so that you don't think that going out into the wilderness is going to, magically cure everything.
So, with that in mind, you sent me this paper a few weeks ago called "Levels of Nature and Stress Response." Can you give us kind of a brief overview of this paper, and then you and I can kind of chat a little bit about it and maybe share some of our own experiences?
Yeah, you bet. So this is a research group out of Indiana University, out of Bloomington and Illinois State. And the premise behind it is to say, okay, we all have heard the idea that if you go outside, it's better for your mental health.
Hmm.
So they wanted to tackle the question, well, what kind of outside or what kind of recreation actually contributes to an improvement in mental health? And so they looked at people being in an indoor exercise facility that has a track and a gym and treadmills and things like that, and a second environment which was akin to a city park. So something that has some nature, but also some man-made structures like park benches and playgrounds. And the third one was a a completely natural setting. So a 1,200 acre forested area with trails that went down ravines and up on ridges, and you don't have the human structures like playground equipment, and you can't hear the highway and things like that. So it's a much more natural environment. So they wanted to put people in each of these three environments and measure their stress response. And the way they did that was by monitoring cortisol and alpha amylase. Now, cortisol is a steroid hormone that that's involved in your fight or flight response. And
Right,
so,
commonly called the stress hormone, right?
yep, that's exactly right. And so the thing with cortisol is that if you have chronic levels of cortisol, it's produced by your adrenal glands. If your adrenal glands are constantly active in response to like low grade stimuli that creates just chronic stress, then it can cause some really problematic health issues. One of the biggest ones is that it tends to suppress the immune system. And for hikers, might be interested in the fact that it contributes to muscle wastage. And so in the presence of cortisol, protein catabolism is an issue. And so you have to be really careful that when you're training or maybe going through a through hike, some big activity, and you're under chronic stress, that can be a counterproductive thing to go through. The second biomarker they used was alpha amylase. It's found in saliva. It's secreted when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, and that is typically activated in response to events related to either stress or perceived threats. And so the difference between amylase and cortisol is that cortisol tends to hang around for a longer period of time. Amylase tends to drop very quickly. So usually when the stimuli is removed, amylase returns to baseline within about 10 minutes or so, and it can be flushed out of your body a little bit easier than cortisol through exercise and physical stress. So if you put physical stress on your body, amylase tends to go away. So they use those as biomarkers, and they found that people who were in the most natural environment had the lowest levels of cortisol and amylase. Now, this isn't a definitive study by any means, but it adds to a growing body of research that suggests that specifically exercise and exercise in natural environments has a pretty notable impact on the body's stress response. So I can't help but think, what's it like if you go spend extended periods of time in wilderness, right? Sleeping, eating, hiking out in an environment where there's zero human impact, no noise. And I just have to think that if we take that to an extension, that we're going to have the ability to reset our bodies. And for me, that's like motivation to say, okay, I need some wilderness time for a few days here.
Yeah. I think this has got to be why people look at through hikes as such transformative experiences, when they get done with them. There's definitely something at work here about length of time and the fact that you're exercising and the fact that you're doing it. Even if you're on a through hike, you're not in wilderness by any means, every single day, but it's enough, I think, to make a huge noticeable difference.
You are removing the stimuli of modern first world information society, and I think that's huge. And for me, I've always had my most creative, productive periods of time after a long hike, and I've always looked forward to that. So if I go out for a week-long backpacking trip, I know that next week is going to be super fun because my juices are flowing. And stress has always interfered with the creative process. I'm sure you've experienced that as well. And so being able to reset that, I think, allows us to come back home and solve problems and create things much more easily.
Yeah. And I love that you use the word reset, because I think that people can misunderstand the difference between a reset and a fix.
Definitely. Yeah.
And I know this is something, so just a little background on me. I did my first big through hike in 2012 of the AT. And um, at the time I was suffering from undiagnosed depression and anxiety. And when I got done hiking, after 4.5 months, I felt great. I mean, physically I didn't feel great, but my mind felt amazing. And within a few weeks of being out there, a lot of the symptoms that had slowly built up in my life had just completely gone away.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of looked around and went, I did it. I'm done. I fixed myself,
Yeah.
and then, a couple of months later, boom, I'm right back, exactly where I had been before I left on the hike. And so I guess what I'm getting at is I have come to realize that what we're talking about is a tool in a toolkit, one of many, and
Definitely.
it's a tool to help you manage as opposed to a tool to fix you.
Definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I find myself spiraling in anxiety whenever the stimuli of my day-to-day work becomes just too much. And it interferes to the point where I can't identify priorities and I can't figure out where to put my time because I
Mm,
get so overwhelmed. And I start to think that every single thing I have on my plate is urgent and necessary to do right now. And when it doesn't get done right now, I start to get frustrated and seriously anxious. And
mm,
then that manic stage eventually devolves into a depressive stage where it's like, okay, this is all futile and I'm not being successful at what I'm trying to manage here. And I find that before I can go down that depressive path, if I can spend an extended period of time outside and reset and think through and meditate through all the things that I think are urgent and critical, I eventually am able to acknowledge that almost every one of them is not urgent and critical, but that
mm.
takes time. I cannot do this in a 30-minute walk. Sometimes it takes a day, 2 days, 5 days, depending on how bad it is. And but I'm able to eventually desensitized to all that and look at it more objectively and realize that, okay, this is not the number one things in my life right now. They're just things that need to be addressed. They are not, they don't need to be sources of anxiety for me. And so for for me, the wilderness has always been about that reset and perspective. And then I come back and I look at those 10 things that are on my plate and say, 9 of those are going away. I'm just going to tackle the one.
Right, right. Well, because you were out in a place that you couldn't do them, so they
Right,
weren't getting done one way or the
yeah,
other.
that's
Yeah,
right, and it felt good.
yeah, yeah. I wonder. So I think one of the things that this study is getting at is that, like, if someone had locked you in a room in a concrete cell for the same period of time, even though you'd be physically incapable, you'd have to be alone with your thoughts. There would be a different response.
I can imagine. It's like waiting in line at the driver's license bureau, it's a very different experience because there's nothing to do except be anxious about everything,
Mm, hmm. Right. So it's not that the outdoors has no stimulus.
That's
It's the
right.
it's the kind of stimulus it is.
Exactly right, yes, and there's so much research out there now that suggests the idea that greenery, the forest, the plants have a really positive impact on your mental health visually. And even when they've done studies on deaf people excuse me, blind people, there is some kind of nasal response that is pleasing to their stress hormones, and it's really incredible.
Yeah, the paper makes mention of this. It's called Phylogenic Perspective,
Yes, right.
and yeah, and it's the idea um, that things like water and spatial openness and like the smell of grass and the sound of wind through the trees
Yeah,
are all things that are deeply ingrained in our genetic, code and our
yeah.
psyche and what we kind of evolved to respond to positively.
Right. It's interesting that these sleep apps and sleep machines use sounds of nature rather than, sounds of the highway.
So I have a funny story about that. So I grew up in the Southeast where there's, you can't even I never went to sleep without hearing the sound of cicadas or crickets or frogs, even in the wintertime. And out here in the winter when I go camping, it's just totally silent. Totally silent.
Right. Yep.
And so last time I was out camping, I actually turned on my cicada noise on my phone
That's
so that
pretty
I can
funny.
get a little bit of natural sound and all the snow.
Yeah, see, I'm so used to the quiet of the West. And when I went to help Chase move into graduate school in Hartford, Connecticut, and there's cicadas every single night, and it is cacophony. And I
It is. It
I
is.
I could not sleep. I was like, "What is that?" And it took me a few days to kind of settle into it, but eventually I came to look forward to it, but it was a jarring experience.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about because one thing I thought was really interesting and a great point that you made in your article that you wrote was that sometimes getting out into the woods, it doesn't automatically make things better. In fact, sometimes what it does is give you the space to be overwhelmed by your anxiety and depression. And that's definitely happened to me too. And I know it's happened to a lot of people. So, what tools have you developed for dealing with that? And we can talk a little bit about if there's any gear that's helped you with that too.
I think specifically when I'm in this state of depression or a state of high anxiety, I need things to be as absolutely simple as possible. I remember one trip where I left the trailhead feeling completely overwhelmed and anxious, and I had the idea that I was going to go into the wild for a couple days. I was going to go climbing, so I had climbing gear. I was going to go fishing. I brought my DSLR camera. I was going to have this, epic photography
Yeah, yeah.
experience.
Hmm.
And so, I left the trailhead when my pack was, 45 pounds, and I had literally like 350 different pieces of stuff in my backpack to keep track of. And boy, that made me so mad. I can't believe I did that. And when I'm in this state, I really like as simple as possible because I want to focus on the walking. I want to focus on like eating something really simple, not cooking an elaborate, 3-course meal.
Right.
And so my favorite tool, honestly, is just a bivy sack and a small pack. And sometimes just going out for an overnighter and leaving a lot of the other stuff off the gear list. So I want to be warm and I want to sleep well. And I don't want to fiddle with tent stakes and guy lines and a place to pitch my tarp and anything like that. I just want to stop and sleep where I want and keep life as simple as possible so that I can just focus on removing stimuli.
Yeah, and what I heard when you were saying that was that you were focusing on like your immediate needs,
Yeah.
shelter, food.
Yes.
Um, and I think something that's happened to me before is if I'm in an anxious state and I'm packing for a trip, I am more susceptible to packing my fears is kind of a
Definitely.
phrase we use around
Yeah.
BPL sometimes. And I like your strategy of just like that allows you to focus a little bit like, okay, if I'm feeling anxious, maybe I'll throw in an extra quilt just so I'm extra warm. But
Yeah.
leaving all the other extraneous stuff out allows me to still kind of give that anxiety some space, but not worry about still having a heavy pack.
Yeah. Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah, this topic too of it being hard while you're out there kind of reminds me of an essay we just published by Ben Kilbourne, and he was talking about having a depleted surge capacity from this year. He was talking about getting out in Colorado and being just totally paralyzed by just making a choice. Should he climb this pass or not? Where should he camp? Totally overwhelmed because the last year has been so stressful for everybody.
I can totally relate to that. And I find myself, if I'm planning something ambitious, goal oriented, something that requires a high level of physical and mental performance, I have to go into that kind of trip mentally fit and healthy. And if I'm going into the wilderness, um, with anxiety or depression, I really have to lower my expectations and realize that, okay, this is not a performance trip. This is a reset trip.
Mm.
And Ben's article definitely reinforced that idea in me. And I saw exactly what he was trying to experience. Yeah, he, he called it depleted surge capacity. And I think smoldering chronic stress, current events, all this kind of stuff has definitely reduced the surge capacity in some of us.
Yeah. After reading his article, I'd planned a moderately ambitious winter multi-day hike to test some gear, and I'd said, you know what? I'm just gonna walk 3 miles up the mountain from my house, spend one night overnight, and come home before breakfast.
Yep.
And that seemed to meet my needs without further depleting, any decision-making capability that I had. So it was a good
Yeah.
compromise.
Yeah. You bet.
I want to get into gear for managing mental health a little bit, and I'm super curious because I see here you have listed trekking poles, and I really want to know what the connection is there.
When I'm hiking alone and, especially long miles, it's, as you know, is a meditative experience in and of itself. And so there are so many different ways to use trekking poles. You can use them for performance benefit by, propulsion up hills and stability when you're going down and things like that. But let's say you're just on a level stretch or an easy stretch of trail. There's a whole bunch of different ways to swing them. And so I've come up with, I don't know, 4 or 5 different cadences at which I swing the poles and where I plant them. And sometimes I will focus on that rhythm so hard that it's kind of like focusing on the breath when you're meditating. And so
Mm,
I use that as a means of meditation when I'm walking.
yeah, walking meditation's a very powerful um, way to even just deal sometimes if you're just like bored on a trail. Walking
Yes.
meditation
Yeah,
can be a great way to make the miles fly by.
totally agree.
And speaking of meditation, that's one of the tools that I use if I'm anxious in the backcountry is make sure that I have my phone loaded up with a meditation app that can work offline.
Hmm.
And I learned to meditate using Headspace, but Headspace is a subscription service, so I use a meditation app called Oak, and I think I see here that you use one called Calm, which
Right.
I know is also very popular.
Yeah. Yeah, I find those are, it's not a practice I regularly do in the backcountry, but it is one that I really like to do on a trip that has been disrupted by unpredictable conditions. So if, for example, weather keeps me from climbing over a ridge and I'm stuck on one side of the ridge and I'm not making miles, I might get anxious about that. And so I'll use a meditation app to kind of just calm down.
hmm Another tool that I use, which is it's a little counterintuitive, but I think earplugs are a great way to manage anxiety in the backcountry. Now, some people, if they put in earplugs, that makes them more anxious because they can't hear what's going on. But what happens to me is I'll be laying in my tent at night, fully aware that the sound I'm hearing is just a squirrel rustling through the leaves, but I cannot get my brain to turn that off. Um,
Yeah, I can relate to the opposite side of that because
mhm.
and it's probably because I have spent the last 3 decades in grizzly bear country, and the idea of wearing an earplug and then not waking up is it's one of these false narratives that rarely comes to fruition, but I don't think I could put earplugs in.
Yeah,
At least in bear country.
sure, sure. Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I seem to be in the minority here. But if anyone else uses earplugs to manage anxiety, shoot us an email and let me know I'm not alone. What about map and compass exercise? That's another thing you have listed here.
So I find that digital digital tools like GPSs and phones tend to raise my level of anxiety rather than reduce it, even when they're doing their job well. And so, returning to tactile activities such as using a paper map and a compass is is less overwhelming to me, because I think it's because on a map you can see this big picture of an area that is not available on a GPS, and you can kind of see the context of what you're doing on your trip on a big map. And for me, that's always been kind of meditative because um, we don't use maps and compasses as much anymore. And so spreading out a paper map on the ground is gives you an idea of the landscape, and then you look around and you can find the peaks and the ridges and the things in real life that are on the map, and it's different than a digital tool, and I really like it, and it's very calming to me.
Yeah, and just total speculation on my part, but I wonder if it also is that your a map and compass are not associated with like your email and work and
Yeah, right.
Slack messages and all that
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
So let's wrap up this section of the podcast just by talking about a few of the mental health tools that we've both developed when we're not in the backcountry.
So one for me is outdoor exercise, which is pretty obvious, but
Hmm.
um, this this exercise culture, this performance culture we live in is it's like I need to get my 30 minutes of treadmill running in, or I got to go to the gym at lunch on the lunch hour or before I go to work. And that stresses me out. That I just does not work for me. And even like trying to fit in a 30-minute walk between two meetings, that is really difficult for me to enjoy. It's like, okay, I'm going to check this off my list. I know it's physically good for me, but I'm
Uh-huh.
not getting a lot of satisfaction out of this.
Yep.
So my favorite way to reset is, I want to make sure that my late afternoon meetings are cleared, my schedule's cleared, and then maybe I can go for a walk at 2 o'clock and I have no further agenda, and I can spend 2 or even 3 hours walking in the woods on a trail. There's such a big difference between fitting in an hour of exercise and then go meander for 2 or 3 hours, in terms of what it does to your mind, that is my absolute favorite weekly activity to do.
That's super powerful. I 100% agree with all that. I do the same thing if I'm going on a long run. I got to get everything else done first, and then I can run as long as I want to.
Yep, that I agree. The other tool I've been using is a new app called Sunsama, Sunsama, and it's a to-do list app, but it brings in, your Google Calendar and email and things like that. But every single morning, Sunsama walks you through a process that is very Zen-like and somewhat meditative, and it asks you, there's about 10 steps it brings you through, one step at a time. They're all really simple to think about, and it allows you to plan your day in the most low stress, least anxious way I've ever seen with any other app. So most apps are really good at organizing massive amounts of information, but they require you to come up with the organizational structure.
Uh-huh.
And Sensama basically coaches you through this process. It's one step at a time. You're focusing only on today, the tasks in front of you. And it's been a very calming experience for my mornings. I'm really enjoying it.
Interesting. All right, I'll check that out because I've used productivity and to-do list apps too, and inevitably they just stress me out even
Yeah,
further.
me too.
So,
Me too.
yeah. All right. Well, let's move on a little bit. Let's chat for a few minutes about what's new at BPL.
Yeah, we, as you know, are developing a new website. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, actually. So we have done the planning phase. We're done with the design phase. We are now in development, where we're actually coding everything on a new server. And so we are building a variety of new features to the site. One of them is a gear database, which is what we're working on right now. So imagine the hub of this database as a product page where we feature a piece of ultralight gear. And that then serves as a gateway to do gear research for our users. And so they can connect to our content related to that piece of gear. They can read product reviews about that piece of gear. They can uh, take a look at what the members are saying about that piece of gear, either in the forums, or a new feature we're building is member gear reviews, so user reviews. They can go right from that piece of gear to see who's buying and selling that gear in the gear swap. and then we'll provide some shopping tools to do price comparison and things like that to help find that gear on sale. So that's the big thing we're building right now. And then if you back up from that and look at a database of gear that might be useful for lightweight backpackers that they can then search and sort by cost and weight and things like that. That's kind of what we're building, and so that's the exciting thing that's going on right now.
Yeah, I love that. That's like everything you'd have open in 20 tabs on your computer, but it's in one spot.
Right. And then next month on the podcast, we'll feature what we're doing for members specifically and how the membership experience is changing. And as I mentioned before, we're pulling the gear swap out of the forums. We're pulling member trip reports out of the forums into its own system so that they can, publish things with video and photos that are more beautiful than what they have accessible to them in the forums, and then user reviews. And so we'll talk about how that all ties together next month.
Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and do a little bit of shameless self-promotion here. I wrote a trip report / essay about my trip to the Smoky Mountains, and I'm pretty proud of it, and it got a great reception.
I loved your watercolor paintings of the salamanders that you put in there. That was my favorite part.
Yeah, those were fun to paint. I got back from the Smokies and just had salamanders in my head, so I had to paint them out of my head.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And since it's winter time, also we'll plug the latest performance review we just published. It's by Emmeline Vandervelden, and she did a long and detailed review of we'll call it a backpacking / mountaineering tent. Is that accurate?
I think that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a 3 to 4 season shelter by Nemo, and it's called the Kunai. And Emmeline got a lot of snow on it, got it in a bunch of different environments, so it's definitely worth a read.
It's really kind of funny to see, especially on social media where people don't know our company as well as our members do, that there's some giggling whenever we do a 4-season tent review, because you're looking at a 4 or 5 pound or maybe 6 pound shelter, and
Sure.
it's always interesting to me that some folks just look at weight rather than the performance to weight ratio. And so me being a winter backpacker and coming from a mountaineering background, I look at this tent and think, yeah, for 4 pounds 5 ounces, that's a pretty incredible level of performance. And so it always has intrigued me to review some lightweight gear that is trying to solve problems that has been historically solved by tents that weigh 7 8 9 pounds.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's new in the forums? Has anything caught your eye lately?
Yeah, there's a really awesome thread in there by a forum member named Patrick, who built his own backpacking fiddle out of a cigar box style design. And he put a YouTube clip showing him playing it, and some gorgeous pictures of the fiddle. And that really got me going.
Yeah, I just looked at that this morning. It's super cool. And he's planning on making some sort of DCF carrying case for it too, which is also fun. The other thing that's caught my eye lately is we published a column from Maggie Slepian in her Learning Curve series, and it's called Learning to Suffer. And it's kind of about her experiences backpacking when it necessarily hasn't been fun, but she sort of pushed through anyway. And it has caused a really interesting conversation.
It is a topic that has some controversy to it, but also it's a topic that we can all connect to. So, there's a couple ways you can suffer. You can suffer somewhat intentionally. Your goal of running 36 miles, you're going into that knowing you're going to suffer, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. And you can suffer unintentionally, where you can do everything you can to be prepared, and still stuff is going to happen. And how you respond to inclement conditions or an environment that does cause you some discomfort says a lot about how you can enjoy extended times in the wilderness.
Yeah, and I think the article caught my eye because some people are blessed by genetics for backpacking, and I am not one of those people. And I have struggled with my feet basically the entire time I've taken up this sport. I do not go backpacking without my feet just being terrible. And And so, yeah, so it really, it was interesting to me to see a bunch of people go, well, I don't suffer when I backpack. And I went, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, and some folks intentionally design their equipment kit and their backpacking plan so that they minimize discomfort at all. And I don't think that's the point of the article so much as when and if you do encounter conditions that challenge you, think about how you respond to those conditions.
For sure. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. Just want to remind you that the Backpacking Light podcast is advertising free, so no pesky ads for mattresses or supplements, thanks to the membership fees paid by Backpacking Light members. A backpackinglight.com membership gives you access to 20 years of archives, forums, and online courses. So please consider supporting this podcast and become a member right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe. You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. It helps other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the